afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this morning. It's a nice cold morning from Johannesburg, and I see that there are a few people logging in from all over South Africa and ready to participate in our webinar and our discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to invite our panel members to please log on, well, to turn on their cameras and their microphones, and we can say hello. I see someone's having a delicious day from Pretoria. Welcome, welcome. Okay, so today the official title of our webinar is Pay Gap Analysis and Reporting Recommendations. And I'm sure you will have undoubtedly seen in the recent media headlines, both highlighting and bemoaning the top executive pay that has been covered in the media. But as we know that the issue of executive remuneration is a very complex one. This is possibly why there's an effort to address the effect of executive remuneration in the company's amendment bill, specifically section 30A, which proposes compulsory pay gap disclosures. But today's panel, in our webinar today, we're going to take a closer look at pay gap analysis and reporting recommendations, with our informed panel sharing insights into why pay gap analysis is important in the South African context, and whether we should report pay gaps and what data should be included in pay gap reporting, and what questions Remco members should be asking about pay gaps. The content of this webinar is based on a paper produced by the Remuneration Committee Forum, entitled Pay Gap Analysis and Reporting Recommendations. A link to that paper will be shared within the chat and available on the IoDSA website, as well as probably sent in the post-event communications. As you will see, we've got a great panel in front of us. We are joined, as always, by our Remuneration Committee Forum chairperson, Dr. Ronel Ninaba. Ronel is a Master Award specialist and has a wealth of knowledge and expertise on the subject of remuneration. We're also joined by Annalisa Keke. Annalisa is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Redefine Properties, and Ray Haraway, Executive Head of Group Reward and Performance at Nedbank, and Mpo Nkele. Mpo is an independent non-executive director and a Remuneration Committee Chair of various JSE-listed companies. All three of Annalisa, Ray, and Ronel serve on our Remuneration Committee Forum. So you can see you are in the right hands in terms of sharing knowledge and bouncing ideas and questions. Just a little bit of operational things quickly. We welcome your questions and your comments. The questions go in the Q&A box, so please post your questions there to our panel members. We will try and get to them all in our Q&A session. And then you can post your comments and your conversations if you feel you want to share something on a sideline conversation in the chat box. We won't be able to, that'll keep us neat and clean in terms of where to look for our questions. And we look forward to chatting to you. If at some stage you want to actually verbalize your question and ask, please just raise your hand. I will then give you the permission, I will unmute you and give you permission to talk, and you can chat directly to our panel members. So I look forward to the discussion, and without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists who are not going to be speaking up front to turn their cameras off, and I'm going to hand the floor over to Ronel. Thanks everyone, and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Julie. Ladies and gentlemen, pay transparency laws are expanding. Disclosure requirements on pay gaps and pay information are increasing globally at a rapid pace. Employees, investors, consumers, and legislators are holding companies accountable for promoting the S in their ESG frameworks. Good morning from Atuli, Johannesburg, and a very warm word of welcome to my esteemed panelists this morning, Annalisa, Ray, and Mpo. Thank you for making the time this morning. Welcome to the panel discussion on pay gap analysis and reporting. We published this paper on pay gaps and reporting earlier this year, the moment it went hot off the press, because there was such a demand for an informed opinion about this often hotly debated topic. According to the 2022 World Health Report, South Africa has the dubious honor of being one of the most unequal countries in the world. And even though this is a measure of the wealth gap, it is not divorced from the pay gap. The extreme levels of inequality and the public disclosure of multi-million rand CEO packages continuously draw the conversation to pay gaps in South Africa. And in this context, should we focus on the CEO's pay? Is it relevant that 50% of the working population in South Africa earn a monthly salary of 3,000 Rand or less? And is there a relationship between these data points? As this paper sets out, pay gap analysis and reporting is about a lot more than just data points. We have divided this session into two parts this morning. In the first part, my panel members will each share a short reflection on a question which was posed to them. Annalisa will start by addressing why she thinks that pay gap analysis is important in the South African context. Thereafter, Ray will provide you with his perspective on the reporting of pay gaps and how that should be done, followed by Mpho, who will provide Remco members and board members with leading questions that they should be thinking of and asking when this important topic finds its way into the boardroom agenda. Thereafter, ladies and gentlemen, we will open the floor to questions from you, our delegates. You are welcome to type your question into the Q&A box, and the panel will endeavour to provide you with a response. We hope that you will find the session this morning informative and that you will enjoy it with us. Thank you for being here. And without further ado, over to you, Annalisa.
Thank you very much, Ronelle, and good morning, everyone. It's good to see that there are some former colleagues, some current colleagues, and even a couple of my old university lecturers are actually dialed in today. I see Professor Mongalo is here. Professor, we're about to see if what you taught me in commercial law actually stuck. So just to paint the context, and a lot of this is already widely known, but there are obviously very high levels of inequality within South African society. And what's known is obviously the Gini coefficient that's calculated by the World Bank based on income is sitting at about 0.63. And that number also, of course, includes the unemployed population, which in South Africa is quite large. And it's important to contextualize that, I think, because especially in a society like South Africa, and Ronelle touched on it earlier, the wealth Gini coefficient, which is cited in the Davis Tax Committee report on wealth tax, is sitting at about 0.95. So it's important to state and that, you know, the discussion on pay gap disclosure is not necessarily going to solve some of the structural inequality issues that South African society faces today. And it's important to state that because right in the preamble of the Companies Amendment Bill, that is stated as one of the goals of introducing these new disclosure requirements. So just to set the scene there. But looking, I think, from a broader ESG perspective, which is also alluded to in the paper, there are several of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which specifically focus on inequality, specifically the reduction thereof, and that's including SDG 10. And those actually specifically include, as part of business reporting recommendations, disclosure regarding the pay ratio between the CEO and the average worker, as well as the pay gap between men and women within the organization. So from a sustainability perspective, I think the principle of pay gap reporting is quite firmly entrenched. And some of you will have dialed into last week's launch discussion of the JSE Sustainability Disclosure Guidance, which actually includes a number of metrics that are aimed at pay disclosure. And what's quite interesting there is that they go several steps beyond what is included in the Companies Amendment Bill to look not only at the disclosure of the CEO to average worker ratio, but also the difference between entry-level wages, looking at the difference between men and women on a location-specific basis, as well as some of the differentials between entry-level wages and living wages that have been set by the organization. And in this discussion, I think as much as we're going to talk about pay gap disclosure today, I think the importance of focusing on an appropriate living wage cannot be overstated, specifically if one wants to close the pay gap, or at least narrow it a little bit in a way that is sustainable overall. So I think it's also worth learning from other jurisdictions. And in the US, for example, where the Dodd-Frank Act introduced pay gap reporting requirements several years ago, I think some of the criticisms that have come out of that, in addition to obviously the problem that presents itself when one is trying to include all employees across all jurisdictions in one's median pay calculation, is that investors were not necessarily, or US investors anyway, were not yet necessarily using that information to actually conduct an analysis of whether or not the company is paying equitably and fairly. And because what they found was that the median levels of remuneration rarely move, in the end, there was quite a large outcry when the numbers were first reported, perhaps rightly so. But since then, since the median pay levels didn't generally move too much, there wasn't really much by way of substantive change that could be detected after those compulsory pay gap recommendations came into force. So I think the moral of the story there is that pay gaps and the public disclosure thereof are not necessarily a silver bullet when it comes to reducing the internal pay gap that many companies have to reckon with. So I think within this discussion, we're obviously talking about, and I think the large thrust of the discussion will probably focus on the gap between the CEO and the average worker and some of the more extreme iterations thereof. But it's important not to lose sight of the gender pay gap as well. And incidentally, and I don't want to be messy, but the company's amendment bill doesn't propose anything regarding the compulsory disclosure of the gender pay gap. Only that of the highest and lowest paid worker, and obviously the average and median pay. So it's just interesting because that is, for example, mentioned in the JSE Sustainability Disclosure Guidance. And it is also mentioned in several other developed economies, such as the UK and Australia, which do require companies to disclose the average pay gap of men and women within the organization. So obviously, taken out of context, that's a fairly flat comparison, which doesn't necessarily tell you much, but it is often a reflection of the levels of or the lack of representation of women at the most senior levels, with the assumption, of course, that people at the most senior levels are also the highest earners within the organization. And there are many ways of dissecting this, but I think what is important is to treat the pay gap discussion with the level of nuance that it requires. So for example, not only is the context and industry and the operating model of the company important, but it's also important to look at the intersectionality of the employees that comprise the workforce of a particular company. Because yes, it's all well and good to look at the gender pay gap, and that's the internationally recognized proxy for intersectionality. But it's also worth noting whether there are additional differentials between, for example, African females and white males, particularly when one is conducting a horizontal pay analysis. So based on this kind of very brief summary, South African legislation in terms of the Employment Equity Act it does go into quite a bit of detail in terms of requiring companies to disclose at every level what the horizontal pay gap is between people doing work that is the same or work that is of equal value. And that goes further than what is required in the US and the UK. But it's important, and I think it's important to just state the context as well, when one is conducting these analyses internally, to be able to understand whether or not it is indicating that the company's diversity and inclusion and talent management strategies are in fact effective. And it is important to understand those numbers and to understand what exactly they are telling executive committees and what they are trying to tell boards as well before they are reported in the public domain. And that is why I think even though everyone is going to be reacting to the company's amendment bill, and I suspect that some of the proposals contained therein will form the bulk of the discussion today, it is important to understand that that in the end is going to be a number that is required to be disclosed in terms of legislation, but it does not supplement the work that needs to be done within the organization to not only understand what exactly the internal parity and fairness levels are from a pay perspective, but more importantly, to understand whether or not they are paying their employees a living wage, whether or not their talent management strategies and succession planning is in fact effective, and whether or not they are going to be undermined by these unjustifiable internal wage gaps, whether vertical or horizontal, as the case may be. So on that note, and with 1 minute to spare, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ray from Nedbank. Ray, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Annalisa. Yeah, look, I'm going to try my best to answer two questions that were posed to me. The first one was, should we report a pay gap? And then the second question is, what data should be included? So let me say at the outset that both these questions might well become quite rhetorical, because the Companies Act Amendment Bill is still out there, and it may well then include a requirement to disclose pay gap. So the question then is, okay, well, you have to comply, and it will also hopefully give us a standard for calculating the pay gap. So the second question becomes rhetorical as well. But nevertheless, let me just start by saying, if you don't understand what your pay gap is in the first instance, well, then I think there is a problem. And what we're all probably most familiar with is how we address the requirements of, equal pay for work of equal value. And that is what Annalisa was referring to when she talked about the horizontal pay gap. So in terms of an Employment Equity Act and regulations, companies should be analyzing pay differentials between workers that are doing work of equal value. They should be receiving same or similar pay for same or similar performance. Roughly, that's the idea. And that's the one that we know more about and analyze at length. Certainly the large employers spend a lot of time trying to understand if pay differentials at a horizontal level are fair. And there's a very strong motivation for doing this, not just to meet the Employment Equity Act, of course, but I believe quite strongly that, and this is kind of obvious, but a fair environment, and one that is not only actually fair, but perceived to be fair, contributes to a productive environment where employees are more engaged. And there's arguably also a foundation for a more inclusive culture, which is something that many companies aspire to have. So it's a bit of a no-brainer that a fair pay environment will contribute to a more productive environment. So there's a very compelling argument to know what your pay differentials are and that they are justifiable. But the tricky one is the vertical pay gap. That's the difference between, there's many ways to calculate it, but typically the top earners in the organization and the bottom earners. And I'm going to say something that might well be controversial. And I'm talking about a vertical pay gap when I say this. A pay gap does not contribute to unemployment, but an unfair pay gap will contribute to unemployment. There's a study that the paper refers to, and it talks about unfair pay gaps contributing, or excessive pay gaps contributing to unemployment. The question then is, okay, so what is an unfair pay gap? And this is why this is such a difficult topic to address. We don't know what the right number is, and maybe that is a question we can try and answer later on. But the question I'm trying to answer is, should we report a pay gap? Well, first of all, know what your pay gaps are. Then, I have a problem with disclosure of pay gaps. I'll tell you why. There's no standard for the calculation of these vertical, wage gaps. There's no standard. And that's why the Companies Act may well come and, you know, solve that problem for us. And until there's no standard, I fear that there will be comparisons made between these disclosed pay gaps, which frankly will become meaningless. And I say that because a pay gap will necessarily differ between two companies in the same sector with a different staffing model. For instance, and the paper makes reference to all these problems. You know, one company might outsource its lower income staff, maybe the cleaners are outsourced to a company. And so by definition, you'll have a different pay gap. And so you can see the complexities there in the comparisons that will inevitably be made in the public, and that will lead to unintended consequences and unhelpful debate, and therefore will not be in the public interest, right? But a company should nevertheless be aspiring to, I guess, adhere to the principle 14 of the King 4, which says that the governing body should ensure that the organization remunerates fairly and responsibly and transparently. And to do this, you should be comfortable, I believe, as a Remco, I suppose, you should be able to say in your remuneration report how you address this. And one way to do this is to say how you're monitoring, at least, and how you calculate your pay gap. And for me, the real question is the pay gap that you've calculated on your own methodology consistently over a period of time improving or deteriorating? Because of course, if it's deteriorating, you will have a problem. And you should be able to disclose that, because otherwise, how else do you hold companies accountable? And that's why if you want to be transparent about remuneration, you should be comfortable to report it with all the qualifications that might need to come with it until there's a standard. But can you see my point is really that we do need a standard for the calculation. What data should be included is then, you know, the real difficult one, because not all employees, for example, are eligible for a long-term incentive scheme. So one starting point might be to say, well, okay, I'll take the, you know, the fixed pay of the CEO, for instance, and the fixed pay of the lower income earners. That's one calculation. But that's probably only giving you half the story, because you want to look at other variable remuneration. So this is where it really becomes difficult, because variable remuneration by definition varies according to share price performance 1 year to the next, vesting conditions on the long-term incentives 1 year to the next. And, you know, in 1 year where the share price outperforms and the vesting conditions outperform, you're going to get a number that's going to be outrageously different to the year before, where there was a low share price and very poor vesting of long-term incentives. And just for that fact, you're going to have a very different pay gap. And so the paper makes an argument that you shouldn't look at actual variable pay outcomes, but arguably target variable pay outcomes. Now, a target is a set number that you have. It's consistent from year to year. However, not all companies have a targeted variable pay approach to setting variable pay. And so here you can see the Companies Act came out with a view that, I think, if I recall correctly, said you should look at the average or the median total remuneration of the top 5% of the highest earners, and the average or the median of the 5% of the lowest earners, and publish that as a pay gap. But what they didn't do is tackle the real tricky one, and that is, what is total remuneration? I think it's not an ideal answer, but probably the best one is to look at targeted remuneration, because that's the one that, as I mentioned, is the consistent number from year to year. There are different methodologies to calculate pay gaps, and I'm talking now again about the vertical pay gap. You know, the Gini coefficient is one. It's been proven not to serve the purpose of wage gap analysis well. It is rather technical in the answer, but it's not sensitive to the outliers, if I can put it like that, where an answer of 0 means everyone's paid the same, and I don't think we want that. Or the answer of 1 will give you where the CEO earns everything, and we don't want that. So the answer lies somewhere in between, and maybe the answer is 42. You may know that joke. But so you can see the other kind of calculation that you can look at is a Palmer ratio. And this is the one that I understand as a forum we've made to the Department of Trade and Industry. And that's where you take, it's a measure of total income, or the 10% of a population with the highest disposable income divided by the income received by 40% of the population with the lowest disposable income. It's one that seems to be gaining traction, but nevertheless, that's another model. And then you can also take the top 10%, the bottom 10%, and divide the one by the other. And I think what the point is that you should be consistent year to year to really be able to understand if your wage gap is improving or deteriorating. So those are just some of the key points about whether we should be disclosing and how you might want to start to disclose. Of course, the paper has more detail, and I think at this point I'll hand back to Paul to address her part. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ray. And the question that has been put forward for me is, what should Remco members be asking in that committee about pay gap? I suppose I'm going to reiterate the fact that Remco has a very high duty of care on this topic of pay gap. And as the expert on the board, they are trusted to hold this topic to heart. And therefore, they have to hold the moral compass for the board on this matter. And what is great with Remco is you are slightly far removed from the business enough for you to retain your independence, yet close enough for you to appreciate the business context. So there's many pay gaps, as has been mentioned earlier by the different speakers. There's a macro, there's a horizontal, there's a vertical. And the question is, which is more important? They are all important in different ways, right? They also elicit different responses. But I'd like to talk to the horizontal gap here, and let me say why. It's because unlike executive remuneration, which is reported and disclosed, lowerly employees can see that, the unions can see that, so there isn't much confidentiality there, and therefore they can do their own comparison in terms of what the CEO earns and what I earn as an employee, right? But horizontal gap is salary information or REM information that is confidential because this is of employees in similar roles. And therefore, this lends itself to racial gap, REM gaps and gender salary gaps or REM gaps, which are quite volatile. And therefore, horizontal pay gaps has a lot more in it because of the race and the gender in South Africa and many other differences. And therefore, from a Remco point of view, quite important that the committee checks quite robustly with management whether there is justifiable gaps in between employees doing similar jobs. And justifiable gaps is an issue that must really push and try and understand. And there is a number of things that underpin justifiable pay gaps. The robustness of the performance management system in the business. How robust is this? Can managers have meaningful and robust conversations about performance with their employees and therefore be able to justify differences in pay based on performance? Do they understand why pay gaps exist? Is it experience? Is it performance? And the worst thing that can happen to a company, which is the unintended consequence also of horizontal pay gaps, is you start thinking it's a lot easier for me to just pay everybody the same. Now, that's the worst thing you can do, because this is how you then kill the spirit of high performers who really should be incentivized for being high performers. So you don't want to pay everybody the same, because not everybody has the same experience and not everybody performs the same. And therefore being fairly confident of how you differentiate pay becomes a key issue that Remco for me should be looking at and questioning. And once they have comfort that the performance management process and system is fairly robust and managers know how to have meaningful performance conversations, then they will feel they've done their jobs. But of course, this must be monitored on a regular and an ongoing basis, and therefore horizontal gaps must then be reported to Remco on an annual basis. And if there's any unjustifiable gaps, then of course the business must then budget to close those gaps over a period of time, and this must be monitored by Remco, right? So this is quite a balancing act here on behalf of Remco. And then I want to talk to the macro pay gap, which is really between the CEO and the lowest paid employees. This will always elicit headlines in the newspapers because it will. It's controversial. Unions can make a meal out of it. Employees can make a meal out of it. But Remco, as well as the board, must feel confident to pay their executives at the salary levels that they do, equally to their incentives as well. And how do you make sure that you pay your executives at the right level? You must make sure that indeed proper peer groups are being used for you to do benchmarks to make sure that your executives are paid in line with market. Once again, I highlight the fact of strong performance management and system to make sure that your executives too are paid in line with performance, and more so in line with business performance, which makes sure that there's alignment between them as well as shareholders. So that becomes fairly important, as well as being able to track over a period of time that management or executives' incentives have been tracking business performance. So when business performance is low, it must be evident that the executive incentives also lower and follow the trend of business performance. And during the boom times, or the summers, as some might call them, then incentives must follow the upward trend of business performance. And when you have these fundamentals in place, it becomes easy for the board as well as Remco to then confidently talk about the gap that exists and should exist indeed between the lowest paid employee and the CEO. But then also the duty of care for Remco is to make sure that the lowest paid employees, and if anything, at least are paid within the living gap. Because you don't want to be caught there. So you shouldn't only focus on executives, but you must make sure that your lowest employees are at least paid above the living gap. Quite important. Then you are managing the top end as well as the bottom end, and then horizontally making sure that employees are paid equally, or not equally, but equitably. I just want to also make sure that we don't forget that benefits have value as well, and benefits have got a way of cushioning those low salaries to make sure that other areas of their lives are covered, as in good medical aid services, as some company benefits as some companies have, cost-saving schemes that employees have that have been put together by companies. So that EVP around benefits has a way of cushioning those low-level employees, because you will know that inflation can erode the earning power of many, and the impact is felt the most with the lowest employees, right? But another matter before I finish talking that I'd like to highlight is certain sectors whose performance is also determined by the commodity prices. You will find that executives indeed have poor incentives, if any, during low commodity prices, and therefore their incentives are fairly low at the time, and that is outside their control, correct? But their shares would be underwater a majority of the time. But when they get into high commodity prices, or summers, as one would call them, moving out of your summers into your winters, the gains may be fairly high, justifiably so, because they've had long winters. And the question here that Remco members should ask themselves is, how can they share the harvest and those summers with lower level employees at the time, because executives would enjoy that, so would shareholders. And I've been pleased to see how other companies, particularly in the mining sector, have introduced summer bonuses, discretionary bonuses. And I say summer, not in summer as in the weather, but high commodity prices, where employees are given a once-off bonus during these summers, which can be fairly short, just so that they too can benefit from the high commodity price. And it's made very, very clear that it's discretionary, that it is linked to high commodity prices. And I've seen how this has gone a long way in bridging the gap between management, business, as well as the labor unions themselves, because they feel they can enjoy the benefits of the summers at the time. And as many would know, that a lot of employee schemes are underwater for various reasons. And therefore, the benefits that employees get out of those employee share schemes, BE schemes, don't really, sadly, yield the value that the employees tend to expect. And therefore, these summer discretionary bonuses then balance the pain associated with long-term investment that employees are not necessarily attuned or used to. And I think that really kind of summarizes very high level the type of questions that Remco members should be asking. There are many, of course, but keeping your fingers on the pulse in terms of REM, understanding what the market is doing is quite important, but not following the market blindly, making sure that you do what is in the best interest of the company that you serve. But and because remember, management are conflicted in terms of REM. So retaining your independence is quite important, wearing the hat of the shareholder, wearing the hat of the executives, as well as wearing the hat of the lowest paid employees, as well as employees within the same level for horizontal gap, becomes fairly important. Thank you very much. I will sit back and as the rest of my panel and wait for questions from the
Thank you very, very much to Annalisa, Ray, and Paul for sharing your wisdom in this regard. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning before we came live, I said to the panel that this paper really is just the tip of the iceberg. And that pay gaps is a debate, the debate on pay gaps is just so much bigger than just what we see in the data points. And Elisa has covered the matter around the principle of pay gap being and pay gap reporting being firmly entrenched in companies' responsibility towards being a sustainable organization. And Annalisa, I'm going to borrow the sentence from you, where we have to treat the pay gap discussion with the level of nuance that it requires. I just think it's such a beautiful and an apt sentence. Ray has also covered the importance that organizations, if they don't report it, at least know what it is, and that the reason for not reporting should be around the absence of standards. And he's also touched on the fact that an unfair pay gap could be detrimental to your culture and also ultimately towards the economy of a country in terms of contributing towards unemployment. And in the absence of standards for disclosing pay gaps, MPO has also re-emphasized the importance that boards are the moral compasses of the organization, that in their role of being independent, they need to ensure that management has a standard where they then internally agree on how to assess pay gaps and how to also analyze these pay gaps over a period of time to see what happens, and that when there is a pay gap which goes perhaps in a direction which you don't necessarily want to see, that there is a focus on the respective data points, that CEO pay and reward outcomes align with company performance, and that there is also the moral obligation to ensure that employees who are the most vulnerable in society, those at the bottom end of the economic food chain, that they at least receive a living wage. So thank you so very much for those very important and deep thoughts. I'm going to ask the panelists to please switch on their cameras and their microphones. We've had a live debate already in the Q&A box. And already I think there was a question or a comment by Lawrence and by Mark in terms of closing pay gaps, and I'm just summarizing here, I think, for in the interest of time. But Ray, I'm going to ask you, because I know you and I have had this debate before. Do you think that pay gaps can close over time? Because that's the crux of the matter. Is, do you think that pay gaps can close over time, and in fact, should it close over time?
Well, let me start by saying, if you look at what King is trying to say, okay, that we should pay fairly, responsibly, and transparently. The one that I think is relevant in those three words is responsibly. What do we mean when we say we must pay responsibly? It's about saying that your pay is sustainable, right? And if you're paying unsustainably, in other words, pay differentials are deteriorating, right? The organization is on its way to failure, I would argue, right? Consistent unfair pay differentials leads to bad culture and bad engagement, low productivity, and the story unravels from there. By the same token, a successful company, one that is sustainable, will not succeed in an unsustainable environment. So the problem is that we have this ridiculously high unemployment in South Africa, and that's why we have these high inequality scores. So it's in that sort of broader context to try and answer that question, should we, and I worry with the narrative that says we must close pay gaps. I think that's inappropriate, right? Inappropriate to close a wage gap, because it presumes then, therefore, your Gini coefficient must be null. It presumes then we must pay everyone the same, right? So we need to be comfortable that, yes, we're working and living and trying to thrive in a developmental economy. That's true. Any CEO needs to be mindful of that in this country, that they, in an economy with high unemployment, that needs to be able to work successfully in a successful environment. But you need to be comfortable that there is a pay gap, right? And so I go back to my premise that you should be saying, is our pay gap improving if we are uncomfortable with it, or is it deteriorating? Because if it's deteriorating, you need to address it. And of course, there's two ways to address it. You either pay less at the top of the house, which is easy. Then you have potential flight risk, and that we know is even a controversial statement to make, because we presume therefore that the market is liquid for CEOs, and some may say it's not. Or you remedy the bottom. And you know what's interesting is when we talk about pay gap, and the other part is we must be transparent. We have to comply with the Companies Act disclosure requirements in Section 30. That is to say, we have to disclose the pay of the CEO and the executive directors and the prescribed officers. It's very transparent who gets paid, how they get paid at the top of the house. It is not transparent what we're doing at the bottom. The plight of the poor is not transparent. And what are we doing to fix the lower income earners? It's not transparent. And I believe that we don't put enough attention in this debate to what we're doing to remedy the bottom earners. How are we improving their livelihoods? Is a living wage sufficient? Are we training them sufficiently? Do they have enough support, coaching and training, like I mentioned, et cetera, et cetera? So no, we shouldn't close the wage gap.
Thank you very much, Ray. And I think linking on to that question, Annalisa, so Mark Busson is also referring to the fact that when companies started going globally, the pay gap increased even further. And Ray has just said that the pay gap should not be closed. So how has the globalizations of organizations contributed towards the pay gap?
Yeah, thanks, Ronelle. I think to venture a couple of thoughts, I think the size of the organizations increasing exponentially, and also absorbing, employees from different regions. And in some of those regions, I think the living wage or the minimum wage is drastically different to that of, the CEO in the home country, I think has played a role. But I think what has also come with the rapid globalization of many companies is that CEOs have stopped comparing themselves to their local peers down the street and have said, well, I'm running a major multinational. I should be compared with the other CEOs who are also running major multinationals. And sometimes when I think this becomes a little bit short-sighted is when they actually exclude considerations about the relative size of their company versus that of other industry players, to say, well, given the complexity of my organization, I should in fact be paid on similar terms as they are. And sometimes they insist on being paid in the same currency. And I think all of this has probably contributed to some of the movements that we've seen in the wage gap. But I think maybe to what Mpho said earlier, your analogy, Mpho, about the harvest was beautiful. But I think it's important to say, if a company is going to expand, and there are significant shareholder returns, and there are also significant rewards at the top of the house, one would expect that there would be some sharing of that benefit with those at the most junior levels. And maybe going back to a point that I made as well, I think it's important to note, what is the succession plan and the talent management plan within the organization? Because if the people at the bottom of the house don't have enough upward mobility because of the structure of the organization, then, despite best efforts to try and slash CEO pay, you're probably not going to see the level of movement that you would want to see in terms of that pay gap. So I'll leave it open as to whether or not we should be reducing. I think we certainly should be managing, and we certainly should understand what the pay gap is. But I think what really gets people going is when they see the benefits of the expansion or of the growth of the company passed on to certain stakeholders, but other subsets of those stakeholders, such as the lowest paid workers, do not see the benefits or the fruits of that expansion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Annalisa. In that context, given that I think we all agree that we want organizations to grow, we want organizations to keep on creating jobs so that our economy can grow, the chances of reducing the pay gap over time probably is starting to look fairly slim. And what then is important for boards to look at in the context of the pay gap? What should they concern themselves with around the pay gap? And what I also want to just tag on to that question in terms of what the board's responsibility is and what they should be looking at in this regard is a question which was posed by Dudu Msomi. If there's no standard, whose responsibility is it then to advance a proposal in this regard? Over to you, Mpho. You're on mute, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So the board does have the responsibility sometimes to move against market practice or to lead market practice. And the boldness of such moves must be based on something. Okay, and it goes back to the board being the moral compass of the board. When you look around and you say business is not doing so well, incentives are high, what does the moral compass say? And therefore, that's where the Remco discretion comes in, and you say, regardless of what the performance scorecard is telling me, business is not doing too well. The economy of the country is not doing too well. A variety of things. I'm going to pull back a little bit in terms of some of the incentives here or defer. So there's different tools that can be used by Ramco that are at the disposal of the board to manage what some may see as windfall gains, right? And remember, this is where we have to remember that performance management and KPI setting is an art and science combined, right? So you will not always get it 100% right. So quite important that you can apply your mind, taking into account the context that you operate in. So who sets the standard? Well, the board is the highest decision making on the board. And if there is no market standard, then you must set the standard based on your context. And if you can confidently stand in front of shareholders and employees and defend what you have done because it's in the best interest of the company, then you can sleep at night. But if you cannot, then you have to relook what standards need to be created for you to make sure that your moral compass is in play. I'll go back to the summer bonus, and I use this summer loosely here. There's no rule against that. There's no standard. But if you know that your executives are actually having rightly so benefiting almost 3, 4, 5 times the value of their shares during their summers, then the question must be, what can I do for my lower employees? Because summers are short by nature, right? For the mining sector, summers are probably 4 to 5 months, while the winters are much longer. There's no rule against that, but as a board, you can do that. So use the power that you have and apply discretion to create a standard where there is no standard. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And also interesting that, that we get very little press coverage about the winters, but a lot of press coverage around the summers. Before we step off the topic of potentially closing the pay gap, and should that be the goal? Any other comments from Ray or Annalisa? Ray?
I can add a bit. Now, the paradigm that we have in the way that we set pay is remuneration should reflect the complexity of the role, right? And so when you benchmark remuneration, or in fact, when you evaluate the size of a job, one of the factors that you look at is the complexity of the role, to make it simple. How big is the job? And so the paradigm says that the more complex the role, the more remuneration should be added to the role. So a local company versus a global company are very different in complexity, right? And therefore, you should pay more for the CEO of a global company versus the CEO of the local company. By the same token, the cleaner in the local company, should they be paid the same as a cleaner in a global company? And so far, as we see it today, the answer is they should not be paid. They should be paid the same, right? The cleaner's doing the same job. The complexity of the role is the same. So you can see where the story goes, that by definition, the bigger this organization gets, you're going to have a bigger wage gap. And so that's the paradigm that we live with. And I don't know that there's another answer. There's some questions in here that say, should we be capping, CEO pay? Well, one of the responsible aspects, if you like, of the design of CEO pay is that there should be caps. Certainly on STIs, there should be caps, right? What we should be looking to avoid is windfall gains on long-term incentive schemes. Commodity cycle booms that push, the share prices up just because the commodity price has gone up. Well, is there some kind of method or mechanism or governor that you can have to moderate the pay outcome? And that's why discretion is so important. I believe that we pay remuneration committee members first and foremost and most fundamentally to exercise professional judgment and discretion. There needs to be sufficient discretion in the design of remuneration pay to manage these kinds of untoward windfall gains, and by the way, windfall and losses, right? So it is a nuanced situation, to your point, Annalisa and Renelle.
Yeah, and if I may add to that quickly, I think, back to your analogy, Mpho, it's important to also see who gets protected during the winter times. So, when the company is doing badly, or when the economy is doing badly and the company is affected by that, who is protected by discretionary bonuses? And who gets protected by, the exercise of discretion, as Ray said, when it comes to the outcomes of long-term incentives. Because if that's not being managed properly, and you don't necessarily see a commensurate level of protection at lower levels, then yes, your pay gap is going to skyrocket, and there's a very clear cause as to why.
Absolutely. That's where the moral compass comes in, right? Mm-hmm.
And that's the point. It is about the moral compass. The debate about whether you disclose or not is not, it's kind of, it's the right debate to have, but you're missing the point about whether you need to disclose or not. This is about, are you still, nevertheless, at least as a Remco member, trying to set your own standard in the absence of a public standard? Are you monitoring it? Are you comfortable that you're paying what you ought to have paid? Okay. So you need to be able to know what your pay differentials are. But worrying about, whether we're disclosing or not, and look at what happened in the US when they introduced pay gap, compulsory pay gap disclosure, as well as in the UK. This was too much fanfare that, the sort of release of pay gaps was enough. And what did it do? It did nothing. It was a damn script. It didn't change a thing, right? So we're missing the point. We should be holding companies accountable for making fair pay decisions. And maybe this is one way to do it, right? Because if you're going to have a deterioration in pay gap year on year, there should be shareholder revolt, and that's something that maybe does then serve a good outcome. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And I think the point around exactly that, Ray, that despite the fact that the UK and the US and many other countries have gone with a very stringently regulated regime in terms of pay gap disclosure, it has not changed anything for those countries. There was a recent press article that said that in the US that they're back to pre-COVID levels, 1 to 670 is the pay gap in the US for the largest organizations, and that's exactly the point. Is what purpose does it then serve if the debate in fact is the wrong debate?
And of course, the beneficiaries have been the consultants.
Indeed, and so it is. So Ray, while you're on the podium, there was a question specifically directed to you. You mentioned same or similar pay. What does that mean? And please give an example in the context of horizontal pay equity as per the Employment Equity Act. Same or similar pay?
Yeah, I think that's my language. The employment equity regulations don't say same or similar. Correct me if I'm wrong, panelists, but it says it must be equal, right? Now, the question is, what is equal? Are we saying that an HR business partner in a division of the same size as another one doing the same kind of work at the same kind of level? In other words, they may be both Patterson Band E1, and they're both doing HR services, and they in a similar environment, similar cluster or divisional size. Do they both need to earn exactly the same 500,000 Rand? Or is it okay to have somebody paid 490,000, maybe because, they've just been promoted into the role versus the next person in the other division who's earning 510,000, right? That's where I'm going with this. It's not saying you've got to be earning exactly the same, right? This is art. This is the art side of it, as you said, Paul. Same or similar. So to just build out the story a bit more, if the HR business partner in Division 1 is exceeding in their performance versus the other one that's just achieving a performing outcome, well, they've got differing levels of performance here. So then you can argue that you can differentiate pay based on the differentiated performance as well. And so the story goes. I hope I have answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also, the same or similar has to be defensible and justifiable in terms of the pay policy. So we found ourselves also, having to defend pay which is similar but not necessarily exactly the same, but within the pay bands which you set for a particular role or a particular level in the organization, whichever approach you prefer to follow. And I think that goes with your argument, Ray, is that it's you never quite are expected to pay people exactly the same, 10,112 Rand and 53 cents kind of thing. It has to be justifiably fair and equitable. Thank you, Ray, for that response. I'm going to move on to the question from Kira Lee, where she mentions that the company's amendment bill obviously it requires entities to prepare a director's remuneration report, which must be signed and approved by the board and presented to the AGM for voting purposes. What about the private companies? Paul, I'm going to direct this question to you, please. I can't hear you. No, so Julie, if you can just reset the mic, please.
Thanks, Ronald. If you mind just circling back to him, Paul, we're going to sort out this minor technical glitch in the background and come back to this question.
Okay, perfect. So I think in the meantime, I'm going to ask Ray and Annalisa to also consider this question. As far as I understand it, in fact, the Companies Amendment Bill applies to, and the Companies Act applies to all forms of companies. It's not just listed organizations. But let me hear from our colleagues Ray and Annalisa, your views on this matter. What about the pay gap that exists in private companies? Where do we have access to information? Because I think the point here is that you don't necessarily always have a remuneration report in the public domain for those private companies, and how then will employees perhaps have access to that information? Annalisa, do you want to start?
Sure, and I'll answer this with my ESG hat on, because I think the understanding is correct in that the Companies Amendment Bill, that provision is specifically ring-fenced for public companies and state-owned enterprises. But for private companies, even though there is no legislative requirement for them to disclose the information, I would certainly expect them to make an effort to at least explain what their approach is towards pay parity and diversity, and how that feeds into their diversity strategy more broadly as part of their overall approach to ESG. Because I think in all of the discussions we have about the JSE sustainability guidelines, this and the Companies Amendment Bill, that, we sometimes forget that ESG doesn't have any boundaries demarcated by whether or not a company is listed or not. So listed or unlisted, if you purport to be a responsible corporate citizen and that you are operating your business sustainably and you're trying to create value in the long term, you should be in a position to at least explain, even if it's not necessarily disclosing to the same level of to the same level of detail, you should be in a position to explain how exactly you approach the pay gap. What are the methodologies that you rely on? Why do you feel that those methodologies are appropriate to your organization, and not just because those are the ones that are most likely to give you the right answer? And most crucially, what are you actually doing to manage those pay gaps over time?
And I take it from your response, Annalisa, there should be a willingness to be transparent as well, even if it's not necessarily regulated, that there should be a willingness from an ESG perspective.
Yes, because that in itself is part and parcel of ESG and of the Sustainable Development Goals. So any company that is running around, public or private, that's purporting to be serious about ESG, but shies away from even the most basic tenets of pay transparency, I think we should be very skeptical towards.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Let's see if we have Paul back. Paul, I see I've got a message on my side, says that you're connecting to audio. Doesn't look like it, Ray. Let's hear from you, please.
So there isn't another narrative out there that says all this regulation is increasingly chasing companies off the JSE, right? Therefore, to the point, well, I'm going to become a private company because the legislation doesn't apply to me. I mean, that would be sad, isn't it? That is the case. But we do know that the trend is that, the JSE is losing companies. And we don't really know, I don't really know if that is the correct answer, that they are doing, that this trend is there because of the regulation. But there is another adverse or unintended consequence of all this regulation that has actually increased the pay. You remember we had the financial crisis, and then we had regulations that came out from Basel for the financial sector, and it said you need to defer pay, for instance. A very interesting report was done on this, that because now I was compelled to defer a portion of my short-term incentive so that I could manage the risk in the long tail down the line. In other words, there's a risk of forfeiture of that deferral if something turns out bad for the company or there was a bad decision made. I can then claw back or apply malus to that deferral. The consequence was that the STI just got bigger, right? A further consequence of the need to add corporate performance targets to long-term incentives was, well, now a lower percentage of my LTI is going to vest, the award size increased. Isn't that fascinating? An unintended consequence of good intentions. Yeah. So, but you're right, the proposed amendment, as I recall, only applies to public companies. But private companies are compelled to disclose their remuneration to the SIPC, right? To the company's properties commission. Mm-hmm. Tell me what that really stands for. But so there is, and it can be, therefore, you can actually ask for any company's financial statements, I understand, and then it becomes public. But they're not compelled to, report this kind of wage gap disclosure, as I understand it.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Ray. Annalisa, a question from Lawrence Grubb. Are unions not anti-variable pay based on performance? Let me rephrase that again. Are our unions in South Africa not anti-variable pay? Your view, please.
Sure, and maybe at the outset, I'm definitely not the expert on the ins and outs of unions and their motivations. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that they are anti-variable pay. I think, and perhaps I'm being generous, but I think most parts of society that have some view of how organizations work understand you need a certain variable pay component because you need to drive performance and outperformance, particularly as the market becomes more competitive. So it's not just to say that they are against it per se. I would venture as to say that, first of all, they're thinking about what is going on with their constituents. And what are their pay structures looking like? And even what Mpho had mentioned earlier about the fact that many BE structures are underwater. I think that, to me, is almost a symptom of what happens when we try to introduce very complex all-employee share schemes that are ultimately not creating value for the employees who are part of those trade unions. So the question there is, do we have more effective mechanisms to try and cater for them? So that's question one. And obviously, I think the issue that they have is probably the issue that many others have with some of the instances of runaway pay, where it's not by any stretch of the imagination justifiable. And unfortunately, and maybe it is linked to different factors, but when there are these massive windfall gains, that are, and the effects of which are not felt for the most junior employees who don't get to vote at an AGM and don't get any kind of compulsory engagement post AGM. So their voice in terms of the Companies Act is very limited. When that happens, I think it becomes very difficult to justify one's bargaining position with a trade union, because it's pretty much evident from the numbers that some people have really benefited and other people who are also active contributors to the company have not commensurately benefited, at least.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So such important points you're making. Thank you very much, Annalisa. Mpho, welcome back. So nice to see that you're back. Let me just do a quick sound check because I didn't hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Now I can hear you. Absolutely. Fantastic. Very good. So there is a question by Ntombi Bart. I'm not sure if it's a question or just a rhetorical statement about an analysis has to be made whether the pay gap has in fact widened as a consequence of ineffective implementation of affirmative action. Wow, that's quite a statement. So Mpho, your view on this one, please.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that question. I think this is something that people perceive that it has, and it hasn't. Why do I say this? There's been a lot of research done to compare salaries basically and do pay gap analysis. And there isn't any strong evidence that the pay gap has increased, particularly because of employment equity. So that is not true. That is why if you look quite deeply across the different sectors, there is still some pay gap on gender, and there's still some pay gap indeed on race. And where proper benchmarks are being used, executives are indeed paid within the salary bands in place, and therefore I would like to refute that statement. I think the pay gap has increased because of various reasons that was mentioned by my colleagues here, because of the increase in complexity of the roles, because sometimes benchmarks can be used incorrectly. You have companies that are a little bit naughty and they will choose peer groups that are much bigger than them and therefore up those salary bands. And this is where Remco comes in and says, should you really be comparing yourself with these companies? So that indeed is the duty of Remco, to keep regulating. As I did mention earlier, that executives are indeed conflicted when they talk about their salaries. And I think someone asked earlier, I think in the chat, whether executive pay should be kept. There's different ways indeed that one does cap, as Ray mentioned, but I think it's something that probably is a trend that should be watched to see how effective it is indeed in the UK. It's not going to close the gap. That's not the intention. It's about capping and saying how far, what is too much, right?
Mm-hmm.
Responding also to a question that was asked by the good Dr. Mark Busen earlier, is it unrealistic that the gap will close? Absolutely unrealistic. What could be done in increasing complexities that executives find themselves in? I think maybe the answer may, I use the word carefully, may lay with the managing the REM mix there, and maybe increasing the contribution of variable pay rather than increasing the guaranteed pay. And therefore, that gives enough space and room for downward movement of REM when business is not performing well. So, and I think many companies do move towards having higher variable pay in the REM mix, but I think that's probably one of the answers. Have a lot more variable pay as complexity increases. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and lovely to have you back on the panel again. So glad that your sound is sorted out. Ray, the recent, the extended strike at Sibanye-Stillwater and the disclosure of executive pay, in your view, to what extent has the disclosure of the CEO pay package actually contributed to that labour unrest situation?
I don't know, actually. I don't know, to be honest, but I know that the pay of the CEO in that situation is problematic, right? To put it diplomatically. It's interesting if you unpack it a little bit. The award that was made of shares about 3 years ago in 2018 was already high, okay? We're talking about an award that was at face value of about 48 million Rand, right? Which is, you know, way above what we see as a kind of a range, which is probably closer to 20 million, if you like, for CEO of a large company. So I argue the shareholders might have been sleeping on the job there back then, right? So if you want me to talk a bit more, I can say, then of course, they did very well. The organization did very well under the leadership of the CEO. There's no question about it. There's, unfortunately, no story was told in the remuneration report about how well the CEO had done, saving 30,000 jobs, turning the organization towards more lucrative mining operations. And I mean that, this is how it was mentioned, you know, later on, there was all effort made to justify the pay. And so the share price rocketed, right? I argue there should have been some way to cap that. I argue that there should have been a mechanism for Remco to say, look, 300 million is just an outrageous amount, right? But nevertheless, the short answer is it would certainly have only agitated, at the very least, the miners who are now earning, you know, the 10,000 a month or so. There's no question about that. I mean, anyone who can see what your CEO is earning at 300 million and I'm earning 180,000 is just going to create all sorts of problems.
Thank you very much, Ray. Thank you. Let's turn the discussion a little bit away from external pay disclosure to internal pay analysis. And we've touched a bit, Ray, you've touched a bit on some of the approaches which could be adopted by organizations. There is a question that I would like to pose to Annalisa. To what extent should we consider performance in the context of internal pay analysis?
Sure. So I think performance is absolutely vital, particularly if you are doing a horizontal pay gap analysis. So if you're looking at the regulations to the Employment Equity Act, for example, it includes what lawyers call the Hodgson test in terms of trying to understand, is there a differentiation? Is the differentiation effectively discrimination? And is that discrimination unfair? But that's not necessarily a cast iron rule, even between employees who are doing the work, the same or very similar work or work of equal value, because there are a number of factors which, if a company can objectively prove, are in fact the case, that can justify that differential. So for example, the performance of one candidate over another is one of those factors, as well as other proxies such as seniority, experience, qualifications, and so forth. So it's not as to say that, you know, performance plays no role. It certainly does, especially if you're looking at variable pay structures as well. I think the biggest problem you're going to have, it is one that we've touched on several times, is when there is a large windfall or some kind of discretionary payment, which is only tangentially linked to some kind of vague feeling of performance, but is not actually justifiable in terms of hard and fast performance targets, which have been set and agreed to and voted on by the shareholders ahead of time.
Thank you, Annalisa. Ray, what are the pitfalls that organizations need to consider when they do internal pay gap analysis?
Well, let me just then tag on to the answer you put, Annalisa, quickly, if I may. I mean, a fair pay decision depends on a fair remuneration system. And one of the inputs there is a performance management system that delivers fair performance outcomes, right? And I find this very difficult to get right. So, you know, is there a sufficient check and challenge that you have amongst peers that the performance outcomes are fair? So you've got to be sure that there's a proper, robust performance management system as one of the inputs. And the performance management is one of the, arguably, the lost arts. I don't know that, you know, many companies can say that they've got that absolutely right. You know, it's always a grudge purchase, very compliance driven. But I think organizations are learning about how to have better quality conversations that are engaging and, you know, and look after the holistic individual as well. But pitfalls. I can share some of, maybe having a quick think about it, some of the experiences that I've had in my organization. You're trying to understand if you are paying individuals same or similarly for same or similar levels of work at same or similar levels of performance. That's the objective. And if you look at the Employment Act regulations, there's a couple of justifiable, or I think they call it admissible, factors that you should take into account. You certainly don't take into account gender and race, okay? So you need to be clear that you've got that in the mix. But these justifiable or admissible factors range from things like experience, qualifications, performance levels, and market-based rates, if you like. There's a few others that I'm sure you could mention there, Renelle. But what I find is really hard to get right is experience, right? Years of service. Is that something that you can really justify as a admissible factor, just that you've got years of service? And is years of service equal to experience? That's one of the challenges. The other challenge in a big organization, is you don't always have qualifications on hand, right? So you could be making, you know, some kind of decision with your actuarial model that you would typically have, multiple kind of regression analysis that you would have to look at. How do you take into account qualifications? You don't always have them on record, as I say. So what you do is you try and actually analyze as best you can at face value all these pay differentials using your model, kick out a couple of red flags, and then validate with your line managers and your HR business partners to understand these nuances. That's really what it's about. You have to engage with your business and on the funnies, if you like.
Yeah, never an easy or a dull moment in the life of a remuneration specialist, that's for sure. Mpho, any additions from your side in terms of pitfalls that you think we need to look at when we consider internal pay gap analysis?
I think the biggest one for me is the unintended consequence of trying to pay everybody the same. You will kill the morale from your high performers who shine and really and truly perform more than others. And I'd like to just hang on to what Ray says about experience there, because if you had a very young but highly innovative and high-performing professional in the workplace, they should be rewarded not for anything else but their performance, which may outstrip someone who's been there for 10, 15 years, who may have the wrong experience that for that time, that point in time. And therefore, for me, if you had to put a weighting to different criteria you use to justify it, we pay people differently, it would be performance. We have found people that perform extremely well and add a lot more value without the qualifications and without the experience, but they outshine everybody around them. And that should not be overlooked in any way. Pay is a very difficult thing to manage. And I think as long as you can, with a straight heart and keeping that moral compass, justify what you're doing, I think you can sleep at night. And I think what anyone needs at a senior level dealing with pay is that moral compass. And if it's aligned, then you can confidently talk about the differential pay.
Thank you very much. Whilst you have the podium, there is a question from Jeremy. Is pay equity also an issue that the board's social and ethics committee should discuss from an ethical perspective? So I think we've raised every now and again the matter of the Remuneration Committee considering pay gaps. What are your views around the role of the Social and Ethics Committee in this regard?
Yeah, I think Social and Ethics Committee must, they're there to make sure that the board in general and all committees apply ethics in everything they do. The tone from the top becomes quite strong here, and Social and Ethics should keep reminding the board that the tone from the top in terms of ethics is important, and make sure that all the other committee members, as well as board and committee chairs, bring that ethical lens in all the committees that they lead. So it's not only just REM, the same ethics would apply in the nominations committee as well as the audit committee. So the social and ethics becomes then the ethical voice on the board. And that is why sometimes in some boards, then that part of the responsibility that should be with social and ethics is then delegated to the nominations committee, where the nominations committee also makes sure that the tone from the top in terms of ethics is well applied in all topics, including REM.
Absolutely, so important. Thank you very much. Annalisa, so Dudu has posed a question around whether COVID has shown us that the complexity as a value measure for a role and pay may not be significant as the impact that you have on the business. And one of the things that we also raised in the paper is that job evaluation and the outcome of job evaluation is an important factor in terms of what you consider in your pay gaps for internal analysis. How would you consider this comment from Dudu?
Yeah, look, I think there's definitely merit to that, because, and I think it even goes to the discussion we've been having today. I think a lot of it has been focused on the complexity of an organization. And even then, I think it's important for organizations that are evolving towards a more simplified model of operation, or who are kind of simplifying their business model, I think need to then be honest with themselves and rethink their pay structures to see whether they remain appropriate. But I think, and maybe it's a little bit tangential, but I think a lot of the discussion today has been around CEOs. But I think it is worth saying that, you know, a CEO is not a one-man band. He or she should be supported by the executive team. And for me, if, you know, we sit back and we attribute the success of the company or improperly or inappropriately attribute the success of the company to the CEO alone, I think that in itself can give rise to a whole host of other problems. It gives rise to benchmarking problems. It gives rise to internal dissension, even within the executive team, where the other executives sit back and say, I felt like we were all running this business together, but somehow you're paid 4 times more than my CFO. Please explain. So it's important to understand within that context that, you know, we don't want to create these super CEOs who can pretty much command whatever price they want in whatever currency they want, because because when it's useful, we use this narrative that they are solely responsible for the performance of the company, and therefore they require a princely remuneration.
Thank you very much. Anybody else who would like to add to that?
I mean, let me just maybe put another voice in the room. You take the CEO out of the equation, and what happens to the share price? The value of the company will deteriorate by far more than you are paying the CEO in most cases. You can tell, I mean, that's just one school of thought, but we overlook that. I mean, I think CEOs matter, right? Yet this disclosure that we keep talking about, wage gaps, you know, we know that the pay of the CEO is extremely transparent. The job is not for the faint-hearted. But I do agree, and it's a great, you know, quote that you say that the CEO is not a one-man band, and I fear that sometimes we lose that for sure.
Exactly, Ray. And I think even within that, and maybe that is another unintended consequence of this discussion about pay gap disclosure, because I think it's quite clear the thing people are afraid of the most. It's not the gender pay gap disclosure. It's not it's the CEO versus everybody else, or the CEO versus the lowest paid. But even within that paradigm of comparing CEO to everyone else, you're almost elevating that role to kind of being not only the highest paid, but almost like the sole person responsible for creating impact within the organization.
Mm-hmm. But I think in the context also of you know, the CEO paid the lowest worker, the question is whether it's a relevant analysis, you know, where when you look at gender and you look at race analyses, then those are very relevant in the context and the history where we come from as a country. And it's not just in South Africa, but it's also in other parts of the world as well. There is we've had two questions, and it's this is a pitfall that we find ourselves always in as a forum, and we get that every time when we have an event, and that is around the impact of what we include in our paper on non-profit organizations. So there's a question, where do non-profit organizations fit into this debate around pay gaps? And what about non-profit executive pay? And should we look at that in the same manner? Anybody who wants to hazard a response to these questions?
Can I try?
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. I think complexity still varies in a non-profit organization. The lowest level employee will have less complexity than the CEO of a non-profit making organization, but they still have business performance, organization performance to ensure to drive, right? And for that, the CEO or whatever the head of the organization is called must still then be paid more than your lowest paid employees. I think the biggest difference here is incentive variable pay might be very low or non-existent. Okay, and therefore this puts a lot of emphasis on what performance should be, and the CEO must be held very closely to what they should be doing, right? And therefore it almost feels like if you had to apply, yes, the simplicity of threshold on target as well as stretch, it almost feels like the performance of the CEO and the organization must almost be put on target, or just be between on target and stretch, so that it remains high performing. Because if you don't do that, it can very easily slip into the lower levels of performance because there's no incentive. So it's a very tricky one. And must be applied so, but I think a lot more must be expected of employees in that environment as a standard. The standard must be a little bit higher because their guaranteed pay covers or is all they have, right?
Yep, absolutely. And I think the principle of fair and responsible pay applies to all organizations, regardless of form. Absolutely. And I think that is regardless whether you're listed or whether you're not within in a nonprofit, it is ultimately around ensuring that your pay policy contributes towards an environment of fair pay for all employees. So let's get back into the technical aspects. How do you address pay gaps in multinationals operating in more than one region? Annalisa, do you want to address that one? So multinationals and pay gaps, different currencies. You spoke about different currencies earlier. How do you consider that in terms of this pay gap analysis?
Look, I think it's going to, and I know no one wants to hear this one, but it's going to depend, because the company's amendment bill, for example, hasn't given any guidance as to whether we should only be considering South Africa-specific employees or employees in other jurisdictions. And I know that in the paper, we have put forward the suggestion that we should ring fence it to South African employees precisely for those factors that you've set out, including the cost of living adjustment, which can be very tricky. And what I also saw is that even in the US, this has been one of the biggest headaches in terms of the implementation of the Dodd-Frank regulations on pay gap disclosure, because their view is you've got to take the median of every employee within the group, irrespective of jurisdiction. And I would worry that, with an overemphasis on trying to figure out the correct number and to even try and get reliable data from some of the more far-flung jurisdictions, I think some companies run the risk of losing sight of the goal, which is to understand the pay gap and to understand how it reflects internal pay parity. And I think what's also been seen, even in the US context, is the issue regarding cost of living adjustments, the issue regarding how an employee is even defined within the in-country context, but also within those foreign jurisdictions. So I think the short answer is, unfortunately, it is going to depend on the type of organization and probably on the proportion of employees that are located in foreign jurisdictions versus those that are located in the home country. But I would agree with the view that's been put out in terms of the Remco Forum paper that we should be ring fencing it to South African operations ultimately.
So in that context then, Annalisa, what about expatriates in South Africa?
Yes, so I believe in the paper as well, we've suggested we ring fence and exclude expatriates as well, because those can also have a skewing effect, particularly if those employees are found at higher level, are either situated at senior levels or are being paid in a different currency, which is often the case when it comes to expatriate and secondment programs. So I think the short answer would be try to shy away from too much complexity, because I think in those situations it's very easy to lose sight of the bigger picture.
Keep it simple, keep it simple. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Ray, a follow-up question for you from Mark. I came across an interesting performance management system in Japan, must do, should do, and could do. And the question that he's posing is, are we stuck in a paradigm as to what performance management is? Your view?
Yeah, there may well be a case to support that. I mean, we call it performance management. In fact, it is about leadership, really. And why do we call it performance management? You're leading people, so you should call it performance leadership or talent enablement, all right? And there is a move afoot to start looking at it differently. That's interesting, Mark. I'm not aware of that one. Is that maybe 3 different performance outcomes that you're suggesting? I like simple. So you want people to engage with performance management, and what is it trying to achieve? I mean, I believe performance management is about developing talent, actually. But it's about giving feedback. It's about helping people grow. It's about looking after your people, right? You're not just going to have a hard task conversation. You're going to, how are you conversation? That's what we've learned about COVID, right? That's been a catalyst for big changes in performance management. High performance depends on a healthy individual. And we've realized that. So that for me is the change in the paradigm. But what I like to say is, if you're going to keep it simple, to me, the best performance management scorecard has got a plus on the top and a minus on the top. And what was, the positives in the last 6 months, because you're going to probably want to try and formalize the feedback at least maybe every 6 months, or maybe even that's outdated. And what you need to focus on, and it's not prescribed how you're going to give the feedback. So you're basically trying to have that quality conversation. Those are just some thoughts. May I just try and address one of the questions you posed about pitfalls in pay gap analysis quickly, Renal. There are two pitfalls that I think we've got to watch out for, or maybe they're unintended consequences. If you're going to determine a pay gap by reference to the median pay in the organization, and you're going to publish that, do you know that, of course, you're going to be able to, everyone is going to then say whether they, and know whether they are above or below the median. And are you ready for some kind of a fallout on that one? All right, because that will take a few people off guard, I would think. And the other one is about gender pay gap analysis. I worry about this. The UK publishes gender pay gaps by taking the average or median pay of females on the one hand versus the average or the median of males. It doesn't take into account the role that they're playing, okay? And so by not taking into account the level that they're sitting at in the organization, you are not addressing the question of equal opportunity, or what I call the question of representation in the level, right? So for me, that's an unhelpful statistic, just to say, because you're not saying, well, okay, we know that males are in the senior roles and females in the bottom, right? That's what you've got to be addressing. Am I making sense? So you've got to be looking at trying to manage gender pay gap analysis on an equal pay for work of equal value basis, right? The question of whether you have sufficient representation of females in the senior roles is an entirely different and maybe more important one to do conversation to have. Thanks.
And therefore, it's so important that the organization really takes care in terms of deciding on the approach that they adopt when they look at pay gaps, and that a metric like CEO over median pay perhaps is not necessarily sensible, but that you rather start to consider horizontal pay gaps, and then, you know, for example, in terms of your gender and your race differentials, but also between jobs, and that you also select same positions that are of equal value when you do that analysis. Absolutely critical. I want to just touch on something that you've said, and I would like Mpho to provide us with her reflection on this. So when we start to disclose pay, and say, for example, we have to disclose the top 5% over the bottom 5%, or the CEO over the median, and all of a sudden, say, for example, we do top 5% over bottom 5%, and you look at this and you see what your salary falls into the bottom 5% of salaries in the organization. Mpho, how do you prepare employees in the organization for that level of transparency in the market?
That's a very tricky question there, and this is probably where I will chicken out and say, how does management prepare employees for this and not the board? But I think this is where it talks a lot to trust. Okay, trust between the employee as well as the employer, the psychological contract that an employee has with the company. Do I trust that I'm being paid in line with my responsibilities? Okay. Do I trust that I'm being paid in line equitably with my colleagues doing similar work and performing the same? And if there's that level of trust, then even when that number comes out, there's still comfort because of the psychological trust, because that's what we're bordering to now, right? And there's a lot that employers can also do to use benefits to cushion employees at lower levels there. So I'll give a very simple example. I may not be paid the highest, okay, but I have a company transport, a company bus that I jump and hop onto on my way to work, and therefore I don't have to pay for transport, right? Do you know what that does to my overall budget and to disposable income? So even if I was to find out that I was part of the lower paid employees, but looking at what I do and the benefits that I'm offered, right? It does cushion that message when it comes through. The psychological contract becomes quite important, and employees perform well and they stay with companies for various reasons outside pay, and a lot of it hinge on psychological trust. It's the benefits, it's how you're treated by your manager, it's the culture and the environment that you work in, it's the quality of those performance discussions. And therefore, one should not only see REM on its own, but everything around REM that makes REM a palatable and easy discussion. I hope I've answered that question. It's a difficult one.
It is a tough one, absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think it also so much speaks to what Ray said earlier on in terms of the culture in the organization, because that psychological contract can only work if the culture actually supports trust and a level of transparency and fairness. And I think within that context, it is just so important also that as organizations, we prepare our employees through communication in terms of the policy so that they know how their remuneration has been determined. And I think it also speaks to a question which we've had earlier on, is, you know, do employees feel that during COVID, they've had such an impact on the organization's performance, and yet nothing has changed in their salaries, which inherently, for me, talks to the fact that they perhaps feel that they're being unfairly paid. Any other comments on this matter?
Yeah, I think when I heard the question, the word that kept recurring in my brain was workshops, 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 more workshops, workshops about the workshops. Because that's the thing, right? If you're going to disclose this number without context, without having engaged with your employees to actually explain how their pay structure works, to actually share a total reward statement and explain what is in it. And to your point, Mpho, all of the ancillary benefits, which are not immediately quantifiable, but which are very relevant in terms of managing the cost of living. If you don't position that well ahead of time, then yes, when they see that number in the remuneration report, they're going to go through the roof. And it's going to lead to all kinds of unhelpful comparisons, but very real consequences in terms of people starting to vote with their feet and walking out of the door. So it is definitely, I think, important to make sure that it is sufficiently supported by a strong communication plan that is not, by the way, just led through HR, but is led by line managers as well, who are able to explain this as and when required.
It is too easy to say that HR says that is what your pay should be. Yeah, they have to own the narrative. They have to own the conversation. Absolutely spot on. Thank you very much for that response. We have another couple of minutes, so let's get to the last few questions in the Q&A. Understanding the technicality of pay gaps, etc., could it not be the role or regulations of the Companies Act to lay the framework? Absolutely. I think I'm going to answer this question, Dumakatso. There was also the conversation in the forum, is that you're not going to expect the legislation to provide you with this particular supporting information, but there has to be regulations to the Act that can provide companies then with guidance in terms of how to calculate the pay gaps, particularly those that have to be published. Otherwise, it will be an absolute nightmare, and everybody's just going to be adopting their own approach in that regard. So a tricky one, Craig. Should the pay gap not be linked or compared or benchmarked against the population growth rates and the success of the education systems? So certainly both contributors towards pay gap. Anybody who wants to venture a response on that question? It's not just disappeared, but that was the question there. Ray? Population rates in education systems.
That's another paradigm completely. I mean, you know, the current paradigm says, of course, you should earn what you produce, right? If you like. That's why it's self-funding, it's sustainable, etc. So what happens if the company is failing, but the population growth is increasing? Should I be paid more? It's not going to work. But we should be challenging the paradigm. I think that's what we should be doing. It's the problem that we have, and I have a real concern with where the Companies Act amendments are going, is we think we can legislate ethics, right? That's the problem. And so we can still grasp the nettle as Remco members, as management, as remuneration practitioners. What I mean by grasping the nettle is we should be trying to really, we should wrestle always with the question of what is fair, responsible, and transparent remuneration, and not sidestep it just because there's no standard. We should have our own standard. We should be monitoring pay gaps regardless. We should know what they are. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ray. Mpho, there's a question with regard to the impact of trade unions and their negotiations with regard to setting minimum wage and the impact thereof on the pay gap. So the question here by John, what if union expectations takes remuneration in a different direction to the board's expectations?
Okay. Well, union expectations will always be high. Let's accept that. And unions have got a role to play. And they've got an audience to please. And I think we need unions in place. And therefore, they have to play their role, which is to ask for the highest they can. And this is where the company, in essence, must say, well, what can we afford? What is a living wage? What is acceptable pay? And go into those negotiations with that in mind. Market practice, or rather market benchmark, CPI, affordability, as well as living wage. So I think it should be expected that they will always push hard. But I go back once to the confidence of your position as a company, which would then be supported by the board in terms of what you can afford, in terms of what the market is doing, and therefore negotiate as much as you can to reach the best solution for both the company as well as the employee. But this also goes quite deep into the relationship that the company and management have with the union themselves. I've seen many unions that are fairly hostile and have to be hostile in the media and in front of employees. And when they go into the room with negotiating with managers, they agree on a number and they have said, well, let us make a bit of noise because we have to before we actually agree on the number that's on the table. And management should let them do that. As long as there's a relationship that's strong enough to get them to reach a conclusion without disruption to productivity.
Thank you very much. And Elisa, I'm going to abuse your background as a consultant. The question from David, how reliable are remuneration consultants to determine if salaries are comparable in the SA market? It's one of the tools that we use to measure remuneration. Over to you.
Sure. And by the way, Ray is also an ex-consultant. So once you're done with me, you're going to bounce it to him.
That was too long ago, Ray.
You left 2 years before I did, buddy. It wasn't too long ago. But look, I think to that point, let's maybe start to say right at the outset, your REM consultants should not have such a relationship with the Remco, with the board, that whatever they say goes. And I think to the quality of the information that they're actually providing, it will depend on the strength and rigor of their benchmarking processes, which I think if you know how to ask the right questions, you can really probe that. And whether or not, they have some kind of internal verification system to sanitize that data before it reaches you as the consumer. But I think more importantly, it's worth always understanding and remembering with benchmarking, it's just a data point. It's not the Bible. And I think sometimes, a lot of people fall within the trap of saying, well, the median says that 5,550 is what I should be paid. And so that's what I should be paid going forward. It doesn't absolve the Remco or the board from exercising its judgment, as we've said earlier in this discussion, as to what an appropriate pay level should be. So the short answer is, if you ask the right questions, that's absolutely fine. Some have got very strong benchmarks, some not so much. It also depends on the types of roles that you are benchmarking. So if it's based on publicly available information for C-suite executives, you're probably going to have slightly more reliable data than what you'd have if you're trying to, run some kind of survey amongst unlisted amongst unlisted companies, but also for employees whose pay is not publicly available. But ultimately, it's like I said, it's a data point. Don't become too obsessed with whether or not your REM consultants are providing you with the right data, because ultimately it's up to the Remco to determine what is appropriate.
Use it with the nuance it requires. Absolutely. Thank you, Annalisa. Ray, I'm going to bounce the question from Jeremy onto you. I think also just in the interest of time, should the Banking Association not guide or set the methodology for its members in terms of wage gap inequality?
Yeah, it's an interesting possibility that might come about as a last resort if we don't solve it on our own, or if the Companies Act doesn't solve it. In other words, a sectoral determination might be the way to go. The problem, of course, is then you get a different treatment for one sector versus another, because we know that inevitably these pay gap ratios, whatever you want to call them, will be compared across the board. And if you don't have one standard, you're just going to feed the fire, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I believe that's going to be on your to-do list to look at after this session. There's a question to you, Lawrence Grubb. Should Remcos use or not use independent advisors to assist in providing expertise and validation?
I think they should. They should use independent advisors, and why is this? Remcos will not know everything, because they will not, right? It's their responsibility to keep up to date with what's happening in the market and the changes around REM. It's their duty, but they will not know everything. So it's important to plug into someone whose day job is to plug into the market consistently in terms of what's happening in the REM space. But it doesn't take away the responsibility of Remco to make informed decisions based on the advice and the information they get. And therefore, information they get from an advisor is also one data point to take into account. What Remco has is the advantage of being close enough to the business to understand what's happening in the business, and therefore apply what information they get from the market, from consultants, from management, taking into account the best interest of the company, and also wearing a shareholder's hat who is not necessarily in those meetings, but shareholder interest, as well as executive, as well as employees' hat. And this goes to how important it is to select Remco members that understand REM, because REM is very complex. It goes to who sits on the remuneration committee and to what extent do they understand REM for them to apply their mind adequately.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think whilst you have the podium, there is a question to you from Tommy. Does remote or anywhere work justifies pay inequality? So you've mentioned the importance of benefits and benefits to be considered when you look at pay gaps. So the benefits in terms of working from home, is that, in your view, a contributor to pay inequality?
There's a definite trend, not only just, globally, that's coming up where employees are given an option to work from home. And if you choose to work from home, then you get a 20% or 10% cut on your salary, because you're saving on fuel to go to work, you're saving on many other things. But you are also working much harder because you use what you would use on travel time you use to work, right? It has been proven that people work harder when they work from home, but it doesn't apply to the majority, to some people, unfortunately. And therefore, it has been an elective for employees to work from home and therefore take the 10%. And it's been well accepted in other companies. Is it something that, is this a trend that could take root? It could. Is it justifiable? In my mind, probably not, particularly for employees that then work harder because they work from the home than compared to going to the office. And therefore, for me, that balances. You may be saving on petrol, but you're probably putting an extra 2 hours of work because you're working from home. That is if you do. And therefore, I'm not giving you a straight answer there, but I think it's a debate, and let's see how it unfolds. But it has been applied effectively. I have had a few executives that say to me, I'm willing to take a 20% cut if my company insists that I work at the office, 20% cut to go join a company that offers remote working. So to some employees, it's seen as a benefit. And allow me, Ronel, to also talk about my day job. I'm in executive search, and I'm amazed at the number of executives and leaders whose first question is, can I work remotely on this? And if they can't, then they pull out of the process. So it has become a standard benefit. And I don't think you will see it bringing down the overall salaries in general if it's become a standard benefit. Medical aid is a standard benefit. I think remote work is going to quickly move to being a standard benefit as well.
Fascinating. And I think when we spoke about earlier around the data points that you need to consider when you do your analysis, then perhaps this is an additional indicator that one needs to consider, you know, those people that work from home vis-a-vis those that actually work at the company premises. Thank you very much. So the last question, very interesting, and I think particularly in the context of if you start publishing pay gaps and all of a sudden you have to trigger your malus and clawback policy. Anybody who wants to venture a view on this question, please provide your view on malus and clawback policy as may be contained in your remuneration policy, and specifically in relation with the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. And then thereafter, I'm going to ask my panelists to just close the proceedings of the day with the closing statement, and then we're going to leave you. So anybody who wants to give a perspective on malus and clawback, so not directly related to the topic at hand, but could well be indirectly related down the line. But not a simple answer either, and probably not a one sentence response.
Maybe I can just try and give some color to it, and then I can close with my remark. So malus and clawback is about how you manage risk in reward. And malus says you can exercise a decision to, can I say, prevent money from vesting, remuneration from vesting. So it's a clause that you typically have which allows the Remco to deny an executive pay before it vests, right, in the event of some malfeasance. Clawback is about basically saying, you've been paid the money, I want you to pay it back because you've misbehaved. So it's about trying to reach responsible pay, and it's something that's well established in the banking sector. And yes, it should be in the remuneration report. Shareholders are increasingly calling for it across the sectors. The telcos are now fully adopting this as well. So that's just yeah, it should be. There is a problem with the BCA clawback and the BCA. There is a conflict there that you can't legally claw back money that was, unless it was paid in error, and you've got to prove that it's paid in error. And it's a very legal kind of concept, which I think you should take legal advice on, is my view. Just perhaps then, if I may, then just a few closing thoughts. I think it's fair to say that we shouldn't begrudge the success of the few, right? So we need CEOs to be successful for a sustainable environment, but by the same token, we need fairly paid employees for a sustainable environment, right? First point. Second point is you must know your pay gap. There's no excuse if you don't know what your pay gap is. And then I thought just some actionable points that you could think about is, I think responsible organizations should have a fair pay charter. It's something that the UK is pretty good at, where you set out your principles of what you believe in about fair pay, right? And make it public, number one. Number two, the people who make pay decisions, you should train them. And you should make that training compulsory so that they know what a fair pay outcome is. They should be familiar with equal pay for work of equal value regulations, should be compulsory. And then if you don't get that right, maybe your pay decisions should be left to artificial intelligence, which make non-biased decisions. It's coming. I think that day is coming, and I'll be ready for that, I hope. Thanks, Ronald. Thank you very much to the panel. Cheers, guys.
Thank you, Ray. Annalisa, closing comment?
Sure. I think my closing comment in short would be, let's not lose sight of the bigger objective. I worry sometimes with all of the discussions about the Companies Amendment Bill that, that is almost going to become the raison d'etre of really considering pay levels within the organization. And that might, for some companies, be used as the only proxy for considering internal pay equity. But ultimately, I think it does fall on each company to understand and to be able to justify its pay practices and the outcomes, especially considering the economic environment and the socio-economic environment that we work in. And that we operate in. And I think to selfishly, refuse to justify a certain pay differential because, you feel that so-and-so has performed, and has provided stellar returns, not taking into account the unemployment rate, the Gini coefficient, the different stresses on the socioeconomic context. I think ultimately any company that takes that approach is setting itself up to fail. So ultimately, think about it within the context of your diversity and talent management plans, and don't spend all of your time worrying about the nuances of the Companies Amendment Bill. Thanks.
Thank you, Annalisa. Mpho, final comments from you.
Thank you, Ronel. I think from a board point of view, duty of care and that moral compass really becomes a guiding light there. Ethics around pay is big, but you cannot apply ethics on pay if you don't understand pay in itself. So quite important that you have Remco members that understand pay and know what to look out for. And pay gap is a very important topic and must be looked at and robustly checked continuously to check the trend line. But I think ability to understand justifiable pay gaps is really what's important. Otherwise, I worry about the unintended consequences of applying same brush to everyone to hide away from this very contentious topic. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. A very big thank you to the panelists today for participating in this morning's event. I think parting comment from my side is that equal pay starts with equal opportunities. And as much as it's the responsibility of every organization to ensure that there is a policy that talks to fair and responsible pay practices, that is not going to be the answer in terms of addressing pay inequality. And we have to look far wider than just a pay policy to address these matters. Over to you, Julie. Thank you very much.
I want to say a big thank you to our panelists and to our facilitator, Ronel. It's been a fantastic session, lots of information, lots of comments, and I would really like to ask those of you still online to please scan the QR code and give us your feedback. We really appreciate it. We will have another Remco session in mid-August on the principal agent theory, and I would an invite to that will be sent out with more information. And thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, everyone. It's been a fantastic morning and great discussions. We look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you very much. Keep well and goodbye.